Well, welcome back to our walk through the Bible. We are in 1 Kings. When we left 2 Samuel, we saw David as a healthy, vibrant man. Earlier than that, actually, when he was young, and then even in his middle age, he is still a healthy man. But 1 Kings begins with David is old, and he can't stay warm, even though they bring a young woman to him. And that's how 1 Kings begins. Well, it's important to keep in mind that not only do we have the transition from David to Solomon in 1 Kings, still in the period of the United Kingdom, those three kings of the United Kingdom, of course, being Saul, David, and Solomon, each reigning for 40 years, but it's in 1 Kings that we have the information given of why that one kingdom was divided into the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. So the way to outline the book is the first 11 chapters are the time of the United Kingdom still, and then chapters 12 through 22, a time of the divided kingdom, which carries on over into 2 Kings. So let's go back to that first chapter. The first two chapters is basically all we have with David before he dies. It's interesting as he is portrayed as being both sexually and politically impotent, that his son Adonijah says, okay, I'm going to be king, and he steps forward, and that's when Nathan comes to Bathsheba and urges her to go and talk to David so that he can proclaim Solomon as king. And so he does that, and then in chapter 2 is where we have David's wonderful words of wisdom to Solomon, and we're going to talk about that here in a few minutes with our guest for today, Kevin Clay. But his charge to Solomon is just golden. It's wonderful. Now there's some things that happen after the charge that we wish we didn't have to hear about, but the charge itself is beautiful. So that's David in chapters 1 and 2, and then chapters 3 through 11 is about Solomon and his 40-year reign. And I want you to notice in chapter 3 and verse 3 this initial description of Solomon. It says, now Solomon loved the Lord. He loved the Lord. Now, later on, his heart's going to be turned away from the Lord. But I'm so glad that we have this in chapter 3, verse 3. He loved the Lord, and he walked in the statutes of his father David, except he sacrificed and burned incense on the high places. And we're going to see that kind of as a pattern with these other kings when we get into the period of the divided kingdom, that even with the kings that are proclaimed good, they're not perfect. And Solomon certainly was not perfect as well as he begins his reign. But also there in chapter 3 we have one of Solomon's prayers, and it really shows us his heart as well. Chapter 3, beginning in verses 7 through 9, where he says, I'm a little child. He has a very humble spirit. He says, I really don't know what all I need to be doing. And so he asks God for a spirit of discernment, to be able to discern between good and evil. And this is very pleasing to God. And God will respond with not only giving him that spirit of discernment, but giving him so much more so that he can reign with resources and reign with great power and wisdom. Gives him knowledge in all kinds of topics. And so it's a beautiful time for Solomon. It's his rise. It's like we saw with Saul and David. There's that rise of power where God is fighting the battles, where God is giving increase. But then we come to that reminder in chapter 9, verses 4 through 7, that these promises, these blessings, are conditional. We've seen that throughout our study, going back again to Deuteronomy 28 with the Deuteronomic theology, but even before that, where God is saying there's conditions in this covenant. So chapter 9, verses 4 through 7 is where he reminds Solomon that if you walk before me as your father David walked, then I'm going to bless your kingdom. But if you turn away from me and you follow after other gods and you worship them, verse 7 he says, then I will cut off Israel from the land. So God has been very clear in dealing with these rulers that these are the consequences if you turn away to the other gods. Well, in chapter 11, that is exactly what happens with Solomon. Like, Solomon, did you not believe God? Did you not understand the prohibition that we've seen throughout our study of of intermarriage with foreign wives, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the discussion here in a minute, but it wasn't because of the color of skin of these foreign wives, it was because they were following after other gods. And so it's interesting as passive, as women are portrayed in these types of passages, that they still have tremendous influence on the spiritual health of the kings. And this is true even with Solomon. So chapter 11 is where we're told that he's got 700 wives, 300 secondary wives, and they are pulling his heart. These foreign wives are pulling his heart away from God. And as a result, the Lord was angry. Verse 9 tells us in chapter 11, and then remember the key verse, chapter 11, verse 11 is where he says, I will tear the kingdom away from you. Same terminology as with Saul. And you remember that even as he was turning away and Samuel was grabbing him, there was a piece of his cloak that was torn off, and Samuel was telling him, the Lord is tearing the kingdom away from you. Well, this shouldn't surprise Solomon. He told him, if you allow this to happen, these foreign wives to turn your heart away from me, then I will no longer bless you. And yet God says it's not going to happen during your reign, it's going to happen during the reign of your son. So that's a summary of the first 11 chapters. Still in the United Kingdom, the main character in the first 11 chapters being, of course, Solomon. Then we move into this second section, chapters 12 through 22. Rehoboam, his son, has become king. Solomon now has died. And as Rehoboam is king, there are those that come to him, led by Jeroboam, who say, you know, your dad was really hard on us. Evidently, Solomon had instituted slave labor and was quite harsh. We don't really think of Solomon that way, but evidently he had. And so they're saying, lighten our load. And Rehoboam says, okay, let me think about this for 3 days, and then we'll get back together and discuss this. So Rehoboam then counsels with the older men who had served with his dad. And those older men are saying to him, yes, you need to be a servant to them, and they will serve you. And maybe they're saying this from experiences that they learned the hard way, but that's the advice they give. And then he goes to the young guys who grew up with him, and they're thinking, no, it's our turn now. And we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the interchange that's going on there here in just a few minutes. But Rehoboam goes with the counsel of the younger men, and there is the reason why we have the kingdom split in two. You know, today's decisions are tomorrow's realities. This is a big decision, and nowhere in chapter 12 do we see Rehoboam inquiring of the Lord, going to the prophets. He makes this decision, he tells Jeroboam, and so off goes Jeroboam with these other people, and there is where we have the beginning of the divided kingdom. The northern kingdom being that of Israel with 10 tribes, the southern kingdom being that of Judah with 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin. With the northern kingdom, the capital is going to be at Samaria. But Jeroboam, I can't believe he does this. He sets up golden calves at Bethel and Dan. That's in chapter 12, verses 28 through 30, and will even say to them that this is your God who led you out of Egypt. Now, we've already been there and done that. That didn't work out too well. Did he not listen to history class? But that's going on. Bethel and Dan, we have this other temple, like I say, there at Samaria. And then, of course, in the southern kingdom of Judah, where Rehoboam is ruling, we have Solomon's temple there in Jerusalem. And there's civil war. Chapter 14, verse 30, there's all of this unrest, all of this chaos due to, again, Solomon's bad decisions, Rehoboam's bad decisions, and it impacts people. Just like today in our families, our decisions can have long-lasting impact upon others. We need to be bathing it in prayer. And again, we don't see Rehoboam doing that. So we begin this time of evaluating kings. There's so many different stories with the remainder of 1 Kings on into 2 Kings. And there's going to be 20 kings with the northern kingdom, 20 kings with the southern kingdom, and they're all going to be evaluated as whether they are walking as, with Judah, walking as their father David, or in the sins of their father. Are they continuing the generational sins? Are they continuing that pattern of turning away from God to the idols? With the northern kingdom of Israel, they all walk in the way of Jeroboam. And they're 0 for 20. They're all bad. But with the southern kingdom, there are at least 8 that are referred to as good, a couple of them as mostly good. So we have that going on with Judah. And in 1 Kings, actually just 2 of those kings are mentioned before the book closes out, and that is Asa and Jehoshaphat, who were doing what was right in the eyes of the Lord, like their father David. Well, we think about all that David did, and we're like, okay, so we're upholding him as the standard? I mean, look at his immorality, look at all the bloodshed. But the evaluation is this king leading God's people in worship to the one true God? Or is this king building the high places and encouraging worship to the Baals and turning them away from the Lord? Leadership has responsibility to shepherd hearts toward Yahweh. And when they did not do that, they were pronounced as walking in the sins of their father. Well, of course, we have the prophets who are in this mix, and they're challenging the kings, they're calling out the idolatry. They were not interested, for the most part, the good prophets, in public relations or how people felt about them. There were some false prophets, of course, that were just seeking to please people. But that's certainly not the case with Elijah, as he is a prophet for the northern kingdom of Israel. We will talk about him more in just a minute as well, but we have just the introduction to Elisha at the end of 1 Kings. But both of these prophets are calling the northern kingdom back to faithfulness to God, and they failed. I mean, they're great prophets in Scripture. We can learn a lot from them, but in their mission, they fail in that. And the northern kingdom is taken into Assyrian captivity in 722 BC, and there'll be no return like there will be later on with the southern kingdom. They disseminate into other nations, and we'll come back and talk about them when we get to the discussion of Samaritans in the Gospels. So one key story with Elijah that's found in 1 Kings that hopefully we're all familiar with, it's when Elijah does battle with the prophets of Baal, some 450 prophets, and he's in confidence with the Lord. He knows who he is, and his call to ministry. And so he tells the prophets, all right, let's cut up 2 oxen, and we'll put one over here, and you call upon your God and see if he can bring down fire upon that oxen on the wood, and I'll do one over here, and you go first. And so the prophets of Baal, they set all this up, and they start calling upon their gods. And this is in chapter 18, and it really gets crazy around verse 26. They're calling all morning long, and Elijah starts trash talking with them. It's just fun to read. He is just giving them all kinds of grief over this, and he's saying, maybe your God's just busy, or maybe your God's gone to the bathroom or something. Maybe that's what's happening. And they start cutting themselves. And even in the New American Standard, it says in verse 29 that they raved until that evening, and of course nothing happened. So then Elijah, again, walking in confidence with God, sets up the other altar and has 12 stones, mindful of the 12 tribes of Israel. He sets up the 12 stones, and he has water brought 3 different times so that there's water all over the wood and around the rocks, and then he calls upon God, and fire comes down and licks up all of the water, and it's a great victory. And I love that scene because it's where we want to be with God. We want to have that knowledge of knowing God's listening, he's going to answer our prayers, that we're going to walk in victory. But then after this mountaintop experience is where Elijah hears of the opposition of Jezebel, and we wish, Elijah, that you just wouldn't listen to her. I mean, we can see that in his story. Don't listen to her. Don't let that discourage you. But it does, even to the point where he's saying, Lord, just take my life. Now wait, you were walking in confidence with the Lord over here, and now you're saying, Lord, just take my life. And he falls into this depression mode of, I'm the only faithful prophet left. And I'm like, oh, Elijah, what happened? You take a nap. And so he does. He gets some sleep, and then he's told to eat and eat some more and make this 40-day journey to Mount Horeb, to Mount Sinai. And it's a key time for him, 40 days. And as we've seen in our study already, and we're going to see it throughout the pages of Scripture, is when God is working. It's a time of intervention, a time of preparation. And so he goes in the strength of that food for 40 days to the mountain of God. And it's there that he does his whining again. I've been very zealous. I alone am left. And God says, come out of the cave. Come stand on the mountain. And he stands out there, and a strong wind passes by. But it's not the Lord coming to him. Then there's an earthquake, but the Lord's not in the earthquake. And then there's the fire, but the Lord's not in the fire. But then there is the gentle blowing. And that's where the Lord is coming to him. And he takes his mantle and he puts it around him, his mantle being his outer cape. He tells his story again in verse 14 there in chapter 19, that I'm the one who's been zealous and I alone am left. And God tells him there that I'm going to bring a man named Elisha to you. God responds to our needs. When we get down, when we get discouraged, first of all, we need to evaluate what's causing us to be that way. Sometimes it can be the very same thing. It can be criticism, opposition, but we need to look above that. When we're walking with the Lord and we're doing His will, we can walk in confidence. But he got caught up in that, and then he was exhausted, we assume. He was discouraged and all of that, and he needed someone to come alongside. And when Elisha does, then he throws his cloak down, the symbolic passing of this leadership mantle to Elisha. And we'll have a little bit with Elisha here in 1 Kings, but mainly in 2 Kings is where we have more of the ministry of Elisha. So we want to talk about some of those scenes a little bit more and make some applications with Kevin Clay. But thank you again for joining us in 1 Kings, and we'll pick up with 2 Kings next time. I'd like to welcome our guest for the discussion on 1 Kings, Kevin Clay. Kevin, you and I have had many religious discussions.
Oh, yes, yes.
Looking forward to our time and maybe 3 or 4 of the key passages in 1 Kings. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me. I'm glad to be able to be here.
Yes, yes. You've had a few things happen to you since we had one of our last conversations.
I got to say, too, thank you for everybody who prayed for me. That made a major difference. So
yes.
Now I'm here.
You're here. So I love 1 Kings. There's so many different stories, but one of them that I'd like to hear your thoughts on is David's charge to Solomon. You know, he's there on his deathbed, and we've seen these before in other passages.
Choose you this day, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So just kind of speak to that idea of conveying what is most significant. I mean, as dads, we really need to be doing that, don't we? With our sons and our daughters.
Yeah. I think, though, my thought on this would be, deathbed's a little late, Dad. You know, that's good, but I think that's the kind of thing, you know, with my kids, not that I'm a perfect father at all, but, you know, we would discuss throughout their growing up. You know, you're driving home from church, you know, talk about the sermon, you know, what he got wrong. No, it wasn't that interesting. Or thoughts about, you know, or my kids, I know they'd come talking about, you know, talking with kids at school about the Bible and things, and discussing, okay, why do people react the way they do, and what is the advantage of believing in God? Is there an advantage? So it's not just well, this is what I've always said, but, you know, give them that mental, you know, background to be able to handle these things and to reason it through, so it's not just us forcing this on them, but they can kind of internalize it, hopefully.
Yeah, those spiritual conversations are so important. And there in chapter 2, he's talking about being faithful to God, and these are the benefits of being faithful to God, and so they're hearing that. Our kids need to hear that from parents, that, you know, we do believe that God is active and that He's blessing us, and
see that example.
And see that example, yeah. And I know that's something that you and Bridget have done a great job with when your kids, of them seeing you interact with people and being Christ to them.
Well, and it's the hard part is, if you have mistakes, I think of David, because of his mistake with Bathsheba, then when who was the son who got together with the sister, and he didn't come down hard on that. And I wonder how much of that was him looking back at, well, I've been so bad. Who am I to say, we can let our own sins interfere with, correcting our children, and that's where, even if God forgives us, we still have these internal, demons to deal with that can affect
There's
our
some
children.
of that even in 1 Kings, chapter 1 and verse 6, where it says concerning his relationship with Adonijah that his father had never crossed him at any time.
Yeah.
So there's some of that going on as well. Well, and not only do our sons need to hear these things, but our daughters need words as well that are building them up, and that they're going to remember. Those words, especially from a dad, are going to impact them for years and years. I'm proud of you, and you're doing great and stuff like that, and God's working with you, and you are a child of His.
Yeah, I think that's the most powerful thing, and once again, makes such a big difference. I was watching something about the Orthodox or Hasidic Jews and how successful they tend to be, but they're taught from the very beginning what the Bible says, that God is interested in you. God is on your side. He is interested in you doing well, and and that makes such a difference in your self-esteem. That's a big word you hear, but just to say, the modern approach is, you are worth something, you are good, you have value. Why? Says who? But if the creator of the universe is backing that up, you got this gold standard, that makes a real difference.
Yeah. Well, as we think about also shepherding our kids, let's go to chapter 11, where we have...
Oh, these chapters go to 11.
Well, we have Saul and his all these wives. I don't know how he kept up with the birthday cards and anniversaries, but he's got all these wives.
He had people.
700 wives, 300 secondary wives, and they're turning his heart away from the Lord. So it's another one of those passages, kind of like 2 Corinthians chapter 6, that it says, don't be unequally yoked. What fellowship does righteousness have with unrighteousness, and light with darkness? And so I'd kind of like for you to share some of your thoughts on that tension, because I know, of all the people I know, you interact with unbelievers. I mean, just rank atheists. You build relationships, you have conversations. Kind of, how do you look at that in light of passages such as this?
Well, that, it's... It goes back to actually looking at what you do have in common with them. I was talking with a friend of mine. I was emceeing something downtown, and a mutual acquaintance came up and said, I would not have figured you two being friends, because he knew I taught Bible class and knew this other guy is president of an Arkansas Atheist Association. I forget the name of it. But I said, well, but we're both seekers, and so we haven't come to the same, place, but, we're both looking and willing to chit-chat. And then besides, he's a musician and he's into video. And so you go from that, and they know, hopefully they should know by, your chit chat or whatever, and you can mention, oh, we were talking about that in Bible class just the other day. But not in Bible class, which I did not see you at, by the way. Not like that, but just so they realize you're throwing it out there and not in a way that's confrontational. And so then they can feel comfortable going, well, my problem with that. And there's people who have legitimate problems with religion. I was talking recently about my friend Pat Lynch, who he'd start his radio show. I'm Pat Lynch, card-carrying ACLU member and honorary lesbian witch. That was the way he'd start his show. And we got to be good friends. I saw him at something, and nobody was talking to him, so I just went up and said, what's the matter, Pat? Won't anybody talk to you? And so, we would talk to each other. That was something in common. But
you were having dialogue. It wasn't one-sided, where he's just pushing.
And I found out
you.
talking with him that he'd come from a background where his mother, he'd grown up in a Catholic background. He had an abusive father, so his mother left. Catholic church, sorry, you ain't going to heaven, and he cut off from everything. And that soured him on religion. A lot of people have legitimate beefs with religion, and they think, as a Christian, you're coming from that angle. And, so
we don't know that if we never have conversations
right.
with them.
And so, you talk with them, you go, hey, I totally get that. That's fine. You want to go get some Chinese food? And that's how you do that.
Well, it kind of helps balance out passages such as this. But there had been this warning to the kings, don't intermarry, and for the regular folk as well. We'll come back to that later on.
Well, I see something that says here, said that Solomon, out of love, and you can hear his wives, could you build me an altar? No, baby, that's a bad idea. Don't you love me?
Yeah. So we should still keep that in mind, particularly in a dating situation. You know, is this person, are you having a good impact on them, or are they pulling you away from the Lord? And that's, you know, sometimes the parents can see that quicker than the
Yeah.
kid in the dating relationship.
And I think that's something to keep in mind when you are dating. And once again, though, of course, if you tell your kids this, you can only date Christians, well, that'll guarantee. A friend of mine, he was Mormon, sent his, no, it was a friend of his, he was telling me about, who sent his daughter to BYU and said, she married the one Hindu in the whole place. So, which for Mormons is very, very bad. But, you know, you tell your kids do this, you know, but you can kind of plant these ideas that, you know, you need someone to help you in your walk. And hopefully if that's important to them, then that's what they'll go for.
It's got to be important to them before they start
Right.
dating.
Whereas if it's just, you know, well, you better do this, well, you can just guarantee,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. Well,
And I know some wonderful Hindu people too, by the way, so that's not a
Yes.
slam, and Mormons.
and Catholics. And so then we go into chapter 12, and well, after Solomon's heart turns from the Lord, God raises up adversaries, and we've seen that in our previous studies as well. That, you know, God, it's great when God's for you, but then God can also be against you, and He can
Yeah.
use the evil nations even against His people if He so chooses.
And
that's-
even, and that, you know, and that's not a you know, final decision, you know, that a lot of this is correction. You know, Rehoboam, I don't want to get ahead here, but anybody, you know, can see, oh, I'm getting pushback from God, I need to change direction. And God's like, great. I mean,
Yeah.
look at the way He did about David. You know, we talk about a man after God's own heart, and you know, when He's talking to Solomon, says, if you'll keep my commands as David did. David didn't keep the commands,
Not
but from
all.
God's standpoint, he did.
Yeah.
You know, and so, because David turned, you know,
Yeah.
he took that correction. And
Yeah.
so to where even the offspring of David and Bathsheba, who started this terrible, you know, relationship through murder, ends up being the
Messiah.
guy that the Messiah comes through.
She makes the list in Matthew 1.
Yeah. So
Well,
God's not holding grudges.
The book of Hebrews talks about some whoopings from the Lord, and,
Yeah.
and we've got to be able to discern those. So chapter 12 is where we have Rehoboam taking over, and so Jeroboam comes with other folks, and they're saying, okay, lighten the load, okay, we're just worn out. Evidently Solomon was driving them pretty hard. And then Rehoboam takes advice from the older men and then from the younger men, and that's that's good stuff. At least he's taking some counsel.
Yeah.
And if we're not careful, sometimes we just won't even take counsel. We just make decisions. So that part's good.
Or just go to the one group that we know will
Yeah.
back up what we want to hear.
But there's nothing in here about him going to the Lord that I saw.
Yeah. That's the main group.
That's the main one they should have been going to. But I don't know. What are your observations on that as far as the old men and the young men? I mean, was it because the older men were just so much wiser and so much smarter than the young men, you know? Or how do you look at that?
It's like I'm always telling my kids, I'm not really smarter, I've just made more mistakes and learned from them. And so I think that's, you know, with the older folks, a lot of, well, these young kids, they don't know anything. Well, no, they just hadn't had the same. You didn't know anything either. You just didn't have the experience. And that's what I think is happening here. And I see, you know, my parallel to this would be in business, where you see a guy who starts a business, say it's a restaurant, and he works really hard, he's providing a great product, and the quality's good, and hey, how are you, come on in. And then the kids take over. I mean, because I've seen this so many times, and then the restaurant, you know, within 6 months is out of business. What happened? Well, usually in those cases, it's because the father came up to that system or that, you know, experience of realizing I've got to do something for these people. Kids, especially of prosperous parents, they're used to getting their way by just demanding it. You know, I demand that cookie. If I yell loud enough, I get the cookie. I get to stay up late. I get to play the video games longer, and so that's their life experience as opposed to building relationships and, you know, taking other people's feelings into account. And I think that's what's happening here. The older guys are, yeah, we need to kind of, these people got some legitimate complaints. Let's listen to them and, you know, lighten up a little bit. Whereas, you know, Rehoboam, I get him, yeah, and his buddies, one of those Boams, and his buddies, they came from that background of, no, if I demand it, I get it. That's the way it works. And so they go with that. And as I also told my kids many times growing up, eventually reality catches up.
Yeah.
And they ran smack into reality that these people were, look, we ain't your daddy, and we don't have to do what you say. We're going to go home, do our own thing. you
Yeah.
know?
So it really kind of balances out, you know, how we look at the generations. Because of course, in the New Testament, we're told to not look down upon young people,
Right.
and young people obviously have a lot to add in counsel as well,
Yes,
and ideas and energy. And yet these older men are saying, let's build some relationships, and these people will serve you.
Well, what you were
And,
saying there is one of the things I was reading. Isaac Asimov talks about that, one of my favorite authors. But about the good thing about death is that because your older ideas tend to get encrusted. You know, this way we've always done it. That's the trap old people fall in. Whereas, you know, then when they finally die off, you know, the Mao Zedongs, the Fidel Castros, hopefully things will finally shape it there. But then these younger people have a chance to get in. That, you know, death is the ultimate term limit to where new ideas can come in, because it's real easy for those old ideas to get entrenched, and you can't get away from them.
Yeah, so that's really a turning point, all of that in chapters 11 and 12. Well, let's go over to Elijah's experiences, mountaintop experience in chapter 18. It's just, it is so much fun to read and to see him taunting these other prophets that are out there cutting themselves and dancing around.
He's having a
going
good
crazy.
time.
Yeah.
He's got popcorn.
So what happens? I mean, he hears Jezebel's coming after him, and it just poof, all of his confidence seems to eradicate, you know, just drain from him. And
Well, you know what stands out on that to me is him. I think he kind of felt like, you know, I'm the guy. You know, he had such a great victory, and now he's on the run. You know, is he hungry? Is he cold? And it doesn't take too long of being hungry and cold before you go, this is bad. You know, we don't know what the physical conditions. We can guess.
But that does play into it. I mean, it did with the children of Israel when they were coming out of Egypt.
Oh yeah,
they got
if you're hungry. Yeah, things get
where's
bad.
God?
And I think, you know, and he starts feeling like it's really all on me. You know, because God has. That's just the trap you fall on that. Okay, God has blessed me in this. It's all on me. I'm the only one left. And I love God's response to him that, you know, actually there's 7,000 of you guys. 7,000? I thought I was it. You know, you've got help. You're not alone. And so, but it's real easy, especially for people, you know, in ministry, you know, and, you know, to feel like it's all on me. I've got to get, or once again, going back to talking to people outside the Bible, I've got to get all the words right. I've got to do this. I've got to, no, God's sending all kinds of influences their way. You know, he's got 7,000 other influences out there. Just picking a number. That, you know, you're not alone in this. You do your part and trust God that he's got it under control.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Well, and just that whole idea of when we're discouraged, some of these very things that Elijah's told to do, get some rest, eat, go through that 40-day period of walk with God to the mountain, and then just, you know, it goes from one mountain to another mountain, the mountaintop experience over now to Mount Horeb, and there at Mount Horeb or Mount Sinai is where the Lord comes to him in the gentle blowing wind, and where Elisha comes into his life.
That's a great point too. God gives you permission to rest. You don't, I mean, even Jesus, you know, somebody just got in the boat, said, I've had enough, you know. So, you know, you need that. And so many times people, once again, well, I'm the only one and I've got to do this. Well, you know, I think that's a very damaging thought right there. I mean, there's times you got to work and bust it, but realize that God understands you need rest, and that's okay.
It's all right. And he knows you need other people.
Yes,
and
definitely.
he brings people into our lives. And actually, he brought Kevin into my life well over 15 years ago.
Wow.
When we were both in Tulsa. And appreciate your friendship and enjoyed our discussion on 1 Kings. And next time we'll pick up with 2 Kings.